Well, good afternoon. As Jeannie just pointed out, a few technological and logistical notes before I begin my introduction of Professor Lee. As Jeannie said, there'll be a time for some questions and answers afterwards, and if you could step up to the microphone to ask your questions, that would be great. Hermione Lee will also be very happy to sign your copies of the biography after the question and answer session, and she's just going to do that here. So if you want to bring your book up to the table, she's very happy to sign it for you. As I sat in my office trying to think about how I was going to do this introduction, my mind wandered, and with it, my eyes wandered over my bookshelves. There, I saw my copy of the first book she wrote about Virginia Woolf, the novels of Virginia Woolf, and how many of us can lay claim to two such books? A 1977 introduction to her works. My copy of the biography of Willa Cather, just now, I'm told, reissued in Britain by Virago. My selection of Stevie Smith's writings, the Penguin edition of To the Lighthouse, and this is not to mention the Professor Lee's books that I don't own, her books on Elizabeth Bowen and Philip Roth, her collection of women's short stories, and her new project, I'm told, which is on Edith Wharton. Of course, we are not here primarily to discuss any of these books, but instead to hear about her new biography of Virginia Woolf. It's become commonplace in writing about biographies of Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group to make an ironic comment about their length. Wasn't the point of Woolf's transformation of the art of biography that we move away from those dropsical Victorian volumes, critics ask? And it is true, this is not a short book. But we sell Woolf and the art of biography short if we think her primary innovation was the short version of life. As we know from Moments of Being and the dozens of biographical essays, Woolf's imagination was captured by the themes of a life. And in Hermione Lee's new biography, we have a fitting tribute to and continuation of that interest. For in it, we have a biography that is comprehensive and imaginative. Its chapters on some of the main themes of her life are useful, informed essays in themselves, chapters to which we can turn to learn about a specific moment or theme. Thus, we first hear about Catherine Mansfield in the chapter on the Hogarth Press, and then, for that's not nearly enough to cover the relationship between Woolf and Mansfield, we get a chapter on their friendship. At the same time, this imaginative treatment of her life as a whole offers a picture of its subject that is true to Woolf's complexity without confounding the reader. It is witty, learned, and generous. This, then, is a biography with momentum, and it has another strength, one that we see anticipated in the opening sentence of her first book on Woolf. This is not a book about Bloomsbury, lesbianism, madness, or suicide, she writes. That's the strength of Hermione Lee's writing, definite, blunt, and above all, interested in Woolf as a writer. In the days since its publication, I have joined other readers in expressing my gratitude for this new biography, and it is a privilege now to continue our discussion of it by hearing from the author herself. And so, without further ado, it brings me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Hermione Lee.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you all for being here, and many thanks to the conference for inviting me. I've come to regret the first sentence of that book I wrote 20 years ago. I published my biography of Virginia Woolf in England in September '96 and here in May. While I was writing it, and since it's been published, I've become very interested in people's feelings about her, their investment in her, the prejudices and passions that she arouses. I've come to feel that her life story is a kind of exemplary life, but not the kind of 19th century exemplary life that she herself repudiated in her many writings on biography. I've just been reading Roy Foster's new life of Yeats, the first volume of which has just come out. And I noticed that in writing a life of one of the other great modernist writers who arouses as much strong feeling as Virginia Woolf, Foster too was interested in the idea of an exemplary life. arguing that Yeats's life, quote, represented a complex tangle of historical allegiances as well as personal relationships. Foster says that a historically grounded biography can attempt to survey this without necessarily adopting the 19th century framework of the exemplary life and merely rearing up what Yeats called an image for the affections. The idealized portraits of national heroes, Yeats once remarked, destroyed that delight in what is unforeseen, the mere drifting hither and thither that must come before all true thought and emotion. And Foster says that the delight in what is unforeseen is a theme running throughout his biography. So following Yeats, Foster moves on from the old idea of the life as a heroic, public, idealized model to the idea of the life as something more uncertain, accidental, and meditative. And this linked in my mind, when I read this, to Virginia Woolf's arguments with traditional or conventional biography, and my own response to that challenge in my construction of her life story, which are things that I want to talk to you about today. Thinking about Foster's approach to Yeats and the decisions that I made for my writing of the life of Woolf, I wondered whether it might be possible to define or to recognize what we want from a biography today. Might it be possible perhaps to identify a postmodernist, contemporary version of the old kind of exemplary life? The old models of exemplary lives, though they do linger on, have mostly become suspect or defunct. I mean the varnished monumental public history of the political figure, or the inspiring idealized account of the leader or hero, or the respectful venerating life of the father as told by the son or the daughter, or the disciple's dedicated witness to the daily sayings and thoughts of the great man. Instead of these, of course, we may now get the hatchet job or the revenge biography, the no-holds-barred expose of the great man's horrifying behavior as a parent, or the famous author's monstrous activities as a husband. But perhaps it is also now possible to write a life which is neither idealizing nor vitriolic, but which absorbs and reveals contradictions, inconsistencies, the admirable and the dislikable, the private and the public, the messy and the unfinished, the repetitive, the accidental and the unforeseen. Readers used to take from exemplary hagiographies the model of a man or woman they might emulate. Now they take from contemporary life writing whatever example they want or need. The reception of my book has made me very aware that Virginia Woolf is a figure who matters to people, not just to us here in this room, for good or for ill, and a figure who arouses very different and various responses. But she is not someone about whom people are neutral. I was very conscious of this while I was writing the book. If, you know, when you're working on something, people say to you, "What are you working on?" and you tell them. And I would say, "I'm writing a new biography of Virginia Woolf." And the response to this was never just, "Oh." I mean, it might be, "Oh my God." Or it might be, "Why?" But it was never neutral. And I was often asked questions, and they would very often be the same questions, I noticed. I would be asked, is it true that she was a terrible snob? Was Leonard a good or a wicked husband? Was she sexually abused as a child? What was her madness, and why did she kill herself? Now, these are perfectly proper questions to ask about Virginia Woolf, and of course I spent a great deal of time trying to answer those questions in the course of writing the book. But I noticed that I was asked much less often about her work, or about her feminism, or about her politics. But it did seem to me that everyone who reads has an idea of her, and an opinion about her, even if it is only derived from the title of Edward Albee's play. It would be impossible to write an unself-conscious life about such a writer. Impossible, too, not sometimes to be afraid of her and of the job of writing her life. And when the book came out, I encountered some strong feelings about her. Some of these strong feelings in my country, it has to be said, took the form of wearied exasperation with the very sound of her name. I was told by my publishers that no features editors in Britain were in the least bit interested in running a piece on my book unless it could claim that Virginia Woolf had a secret love child. I couldn't do it. One outraged male reviewer in The Spectator, a somewhat right-wing magazine, was appalled at having to read about, quote, "God help us, what Virginia Woolf used for sanitary towels," while maintaining that she was a terrible writer and, quote, "a snob of almost psychopathic proportions." I had a terrible run-in with a furious gentleman at a Waterstones bookshop in Manchester when I told the story of the Dreadnought hoax, a story I'm sure you all know, the story of how in 1910 the young Bloomsburys dressed up as Abyssinian princes with Virginia in drag and wearing a beard and got on board HMS Dreadnought, where they were welcomed with the nearest thing that the Navy could think of to the Abyssinian national anthem, which was the Zanzibar national anthem. And as I was telling this story, which went down rather well, I thought, this man with a sort of old-school tie was getting more and more apoplectic, and he burst out when I finished and said this was outrageous and we shouldn't be laughing at the story of these terrible, spoilt, middle-class traitors attacking patriotism and the British Navy. And in any case, why should we laugh at the Navy for getting the wrong anthem? Which of us could recite or sing the Abyssinian national anthem? And this happened in 1910. He was infuriated. At the other end of the spectrum, some reviewers felt that in making a sympathetic portrait of Leonard Woolf and of the Woolf marriage, I had underplayed what was to them her exemplary life as a lesbian feminist. One psychoanalytical critic felt that in presenting her life as a painful struggle with mental illness, I had not sufficiently recognized the liberating creativity of madness. Many of the questions I was asked when I read from the book in bookshops in England were about how unpleasant I found her. I kept being asked, did I like her? Did I still like her? Did I love her? This question came up often, to which the answer is yes. What struck me very much about these responses was the way in which readers and reviewers had their own Virginia Woolf, which I had either added to or altered or not quite tuned into. And this, of course, is not just an English, or British, I should say, phenomenon. My first American review by Carolyn Heilbrunn, which was published in the Charleston magazine in England, has been published here in the Women's Review, reminisced passionately about what Virginia Woolf had meant to generations of American women, and how this appropriation in America was sometimes surprising or suspect to British readers of Woolf. Perhaps, Heilbrunn wrote, "It is strange to the English how fervently we Americans have claimed Woolf as an avatar of feminism and literary genius. For us in the United States, she has become the major modernist voice, countering the relentless male modernists and their fear of women. Because she lived in our 20th century world, because she suffered as a woman in acute awareness of the disabilities inherent in a modern woman's life. Above all, because she wrote in a mode that is instantly recognizable as feminine. Woolf is the genius around whom we learn the rebellion necessary to our own lives." And I think it's useful to set alongside that the words of the English critic Rachel Bowlby, writing about the way Woolf gets appropriated, and I'm quoting here from the first edition of Rachel Bowlby's recently reissued book on Virginia Woolf. Bowlby says, "Woolf has become an exemplary character, and exemplary in paradoxical ways. Woolf is the only 20th century British woman writer who is taken seriously by critics of all castes. She is seen as exemplary, both in the sense of exceptional and as an example. Like the Bible, Woolf's texts provide ample support for almost any position. She is taken to hold the key to the meaning of life and the proper nature of woman. She is the object of both veneration and vehement hatred." I found this vehement appropriation everywhere I went with Woolf this year. At a conference of psychoanalysts in Toronto, for example, I described Virginia Woolf's mental condition as a kind of case history. I presented her to them as a kind of case history. And I was then told by the specialists what they thought she was suffering from and how she should have been treated. She had anorexia. She was schizophrenic. She had chronic fatigue syndrome. She had bipolar disorder. She needed lithium. She needed a talking cure. She needed analysis. It turned out afterwards that what they thought she had was what they specialized in. At a Virginia Woolf conference in Ankara, a panel of Turkish translators of Virginia Woolf, no mean task, talked about the not inconsiderable difficulties of translating Woolf's novels into Turkish. And they all called her Virginia and spoke of their love for her. One young male Turkish translator said that when he was doing his Turkish military service, he thought about Jacob in the 1922 novel Jacob's Room all the time as another young man in a militaristic society who didn't know what would become of him. This was an identification I could never have dreamed up. Another translator there, a young woman translator at this conference, who was very emotional about Virginia Woolf, said to me, "Virginia is so close up to you, you feel her in your bosom." And people wrote me letters about the book, which clearly showed that they were feeling her in their bosom. I felt so sorry for her. I felt I knew her, people wrote. Often her story made my readers think about their own lives. One young aspiring writer said to me that it filled her with more determination to write. One established writer told me that her life seemed to him worth living in the biggest sense, the sense in which most people's aren't. One woman writer, who leads one of the most high-powered, rich and busy lives I can think of, wrote to me, "She makes me want to live my life more fully." Why does Virginia Woolf strike people, I mean general readers, in this way, as an exemplary and challenging life for them, not just as a life set back in history? I suppose partly it has to do with the fascination with what genius is. I suppose part of it is a gossipy interest in the loves and lives of Bloomsbury. Part of it is that she seems both far away and near to us, a Victorian daughter who became a modern feminist. Partly it's to do with the intimacy and the sense of knowing her personally that we get from reading her diaries and letters. A great part, of course, is about how much she wrote on women's lives and women's writing in a patriarchal society, work which is still intensely relevant to us now. And partly it is the dramatic and painful story of her traumatized childhood, her mental illness, her lesbian relationships, her singular marriage, and her suicide, which, as with Sylvia Plath, fascinates people perhaps more often than they are fascinated by her work. When I gave a talk on Woolf to a somewhat elderly literary society in Highgate, nobody bought the book, and I was very upset by this. But I think they were all on their pensions, so, you know. And as I was leaving, I saw two dear old ladies riffling through the pages of one of the unbought books as I left. So the sort of hopeful, eager smile on my face. I said, "I'll sign that for you if you like." "Oh, no, dear, we're not going to buy it," one of them replied. "We're just looking for the bit about the suicide." Of course, afterwards, you always think what to say afterwards, don't you? I realised what I should have said was, "It's near the end." It's 56 years since that suicide, and in that time, Virginia Woolf's life story has been told and retold and will continue to be retold. And I think this is another reason why she continues to be a figure of passionate interest to us, and why the writing of her life needs to incorporate within it the many ways in which that life has been read. Virginia Woolf doesn't have a life, she has lives. In part, this is a result of her lengthy posthumous publishing history. Our reading of her has been dramatically altered by the publication of her diaries, letters, edited essays, and manuscripts, so that we have ceased to treat her, as she was treated by some readers between the 1930s and the 1950s, as the sensitive, highbrow lady authoress of a few stream of consciousness novels, and have come to think of her now as one of the most prolific, energetic, versatile, and professional writers in the language. It's very interesting to look back at the responses to A Writer's Diary when it was published in 1953. The fact that Leonard Woolf had made those work-dominated selections from her diaries gave the impression of an intense, austere, dedicated aesthete, thinking about nothing except her work. To other writers especially, this was a depressing spectacle. Philip Larkin found a writer's diary painful. He wrote, "She seems always on the qui-vive, or on the qui-vive to be on the qui-vive." Henry Green, a very fine writer, reviewed it as one long agonized cry from someone who was breaking herself with overwork. In these 365 pages, she does not, I think, once mention laughter. But the publication, of course, in the 1970s of Quentin Bell's biography and of the complete diaries and letters changed that tortured image to a more comical, wicked, socialized and robust Virginia Woolf. Meanwhile, from the 1960s onwards, rival myths took shape out of the libertarian, radical and feminist movements of the time, constructing Virginia Woolf as a bold revolutionary pioneer, a Marxist and lesbian heroine, a subversive cultural analyst, and a historian of women's hidden lives. Her biographies have markedly kept pace, too, with changing attitudes to psychoanalysis and to the politics of family life. In the 1970s, she was written very much under the influence of R.D. Laing as the victim of repressive attitudes to mental illness. And in the late 1980s and early 90s, her life story was seen to be determined by childhood sexual abuse. Against these myths of heroinism or oppression, in Britain, at least, a hostile Leavisite attack on Woolf has persisted as a pernicious and typical representative of Bloomsbury elitism, prejudice, and complacency. When James Joyce and Virginia Woolf came out of copyright, at least the first time around, in January 1992, battle was joined, at least in Britain and in Ireland, between competing and grotesquely caricatured versions of modernism as, on the one hand, democratic, sexy, masculine, talkative, energetic, and epic. And on the other hand, as all interiorized impressions, delicate, shimmering transparency, and fluid feminine rhythms. I found I constantly was going on the radio to say, no, it is actually possible to like Joyce and Woolf. You know, you don't have to set them against each other. So myths and prejudices and competing versions have settled into Virginia Woolf's posthumous life and continue to change our sense of her. This is what she said happened to dead people in the minds of the living, as when she writes of her friends Lytton Strachey and Carrington after their deaths. So we discuss suicide, and the ghosts, as I say, change so oddly in my mind, like people who live and are changed by what one hears of them. These changes and contradictions and competing versions in the readings of her life create a considerable challenge for her biographer. If she had rules for biography, what were my rules for writing her life? These were some of the things that I tried to keep in mind. Firstly, not to simplify the relationship between the life and the writing. Virginia Woolf is a highly autobiographical writer who is at the same time extremely anxious about egotism. I wanted to resist the dogged literalness of some literary biography whereby X in life must equal Y in art. So, for instance, Mrs. Dalloway is Ottoline Murrell, or Louis in the Waves is T.S. Eliot. It's very tempting to make such reductive literal readings of the work of this author, as she is so aware herself of the complicated closeness between fiction and autobiography. When she's starting to write The Waves in 1929, she writes, autobiography, it might be called. And then later, writing to Hugh Walpole in 1932, after she's read his reminiscences, in fact, I sometimes think only autobiography is literature. Novels are what we peel off and come at last to the core, which is only you or me. It's an interesting sentence, which in a way seems to mean two things. One is that the fictions she writes are her outer skins, which she has been gradually peeling off in preparation for the true writing of autobiography, which she will come to at last. But another meaning seems to shadow the first, that the novels themselves are covers, outer skins for the concealed core of the author's identity. Autobiographies, they might be called. Whichever she means, I think the biographer mustn't therefore succumb to the temptation to treat the novels just as onion skins, dispensable outer layers for the life. I also very much wanted to let her speak for herself in the book, to have her voice going all through, and not to simplify or smooth out the contradictions and repetitions within her own words. I went in fear of biography's tendency towards a thinning reductiveness. Janet Malcolm, writing on Bloomsbury in The New Yorker in 1995, is scathing about this aspect of biography, a genre to which she is in general very hostile. The genre functions, Malcolm says, as a kind of processing plant, where experience is converted into information, the way fresh produce is converted into canned vegetables. But, like canned vegetables, biographical narratives are so far removed from their source, so altered from the plant with soil clinging to its roots that is a letter or a diary entry, that they carry little conviction. Taken from its living context and with its blood drained out of it, I mean, she seems to be changing the metaphor there, but the information of biography is a shriveled, spurious thing. The canniest biographers, aware of the problem, rush massive transfusions of quotation to the scene. The biographies that give the greatest illusion of life, the fullest sense of their subject, are those that quote the most. And although I don't agree with her about her denigration of biography, I do think that quotation is an essential lifeline. And in quoting extensively from Woolf and from others, I wanted to register events both as they happened at the time and as they were remembered later. I wanted to weave an interplay between the past and the present in a book about a writer so much preoccupied with childhood, with family history, and with memory and time. I wanted to incorporate both how she saw the world and how it saw her. I wanted to register her both as a public and a private figure, and I wanted to see her life as at every point connected to the politics of her time, of which she is acutely aware. Just to give you one brief example, in the period of 1926, when the general strike was taking place and she was in the middle of writing to the Lighthouse, I tried to describe the connection between these two events. Woolf would have liked to keep her writing self separate from what was going on around her, but she observed that her responses to the strike, with which Leonard was closely involved, infiltrated the writing self. During the strike, she was writing the Time Passes section of To the Lighthouse, in which, after the war, Mrs. McNab rescues the deserted house from ruin. This passage is, of course, about the stoicism and survival of working people, but it's also about the alternative life of the solitary mystic, the visionary, withdrawn from the real world, the self she would half like to be but could not quite be at the time of this political crisis. And the dark interruption of the war in that central section of the novel is also closely connected to her feeling about the strike, which was, after all, not that long after the war, and which reminded her and many others of the war. But what also had to be built into this picture was her very conflicting feelings about the English working classes. She is in sympathy with the workers and against the government during the strike. But just before the strike, she'd been having another row with her servant, Nellie Boxall, which made her feel furious and horrified. And the servant she is drawing into the Lighthouse during that week of the strike seems to me to be drawn with a strange mixture of dehumanizing condescension and admiration for her stoicism and realism. And in the middle of the strike, Virginia Woolf was visiting her dressmaker and worrying about her dress sense. And a few days after the strike had ended, she was suddenly overcome with horror of humanity in the mass. She wrote to Vanessa, "I have just travelled Kensington High Street, which almost made me vomit with hatred of the human race. Innumerable women of incredible mediocrity, drab as ditch water, wash up and down like dirty papers against Barkers and Derry Toms. One was actually being sick or fainting in the middle of the street. And I had to sit next to a man in the tube who picked his ears with a large pin and then stuck it in his coat again. There's no getting round the disgustingness of that disgust. There's no reconciling these contradictions, and I don't think a biographer should try to. One of the other tasks I set myself was not to take on a position of historical superiority towards my subject's prejudices and offences. In trying to incorporate the contradictions and complexities of her life story, I felt I was picking up clues all the time from her own views on biography. Virginia Woolf thought that modern biography should change in reaction against the kind of biography she'd grown up with, in the same way that she thought modern fiction should change. But one of the main questions for her about the biographies of her generation was of their veracity. She resented the censorship her generation inherited from the draperies and decencies, as she called it, of her parents' biographies, reverential public lives of great men, like the entries in her father's Dictionary of National Biography, or like F.W. Maitland's life of her own father, which left out any hint of his domestic behavior. These mausoleum books, as Leslie Stephen's children called the life story he wrote for them, were, as Woolf says, dominated by the idea of goodness and written under the supervisory eyes of widows, friends, surviving relatives, and admirers. They produced something that looked, she said, like the wax figures now preserved in Westminster Abbey that were carried in funeral processions through the street. In her lifetime, psychoanalysis, wars, social changes, and the reactions against 19th century habits of mind, which included Lytton Strachey's debunking of Victorian hagiography, began a revolution in biography and memoir writing as in fiction. But when this revolution involved lives of herself and her friends, she found herself caught between old and new conventions. Well, what's to be done about our lives, I wonder? The EMF Goldie thing, to me, quite futile, she says, referring to Forster's expurgated life of Goldsworthy Lowes Dickinson in 1934, which left out his homosexuality. When the publication of Lytton Strachey's extremely candid letters is under discussion in her circle in the 1930s, just after his death, she's all for it. There is even some talk that she will write Lytton Strachey's biography, and she comments, "I'm glad I think that there should be a full and outspoken life, only not as a reply to criticism." And then the buggery. The buggery, which is Bloomsbury's standard term for homosexuality, is always a problem at this time. Virginia Woolf and her contemporaries were poised on the edge of a revolution in life writing, which has turned biography into the intimate, iconoclastic, gossipy and popular art form that it is now, where the only taboo is censorship, any secret kept, any sexual behavior evaded, any weakness excused, any mysteries left obscure. She could see this coming with some trepidation. I'm glad I think that there should be a full and outspoken life, and she is one of the people who made its coming possible. But she herself can only open half a door to this flood of intimate, uncensored life writing. When she came to write her own biography of the painter Roger Fry in the late 1930s, she found herself almost as constricted as her Victorian ancestors. Biography, which she so loves to read, turns out to be the most terrible grind, as she put it, to write. She has all sorts of ideas for sabotaging the traditional form, for making it new. Perhaps she might begin at the end of the life and work backwards. Or she might not give the whole life, but give lots of single specimen days and work at the life through those. Or she might even have it written by different people to illustrate different stages. These are very interesting ideas about how to subvert the form of biography, but actually she doesn't do any of those. She comes to feel very frustrated by writing the life of Roger Fry. And the problem was partly the clash between her vision of him and the need to get the facts down. How on earth does one explain madness and love in sober prose with dates attached? And her main difficulty, of course, was, even by then, the need for discretion. She could not be frank about Roger Fry's first marriage, about his affairs, about his love for her own sister. When she read André Gide's explicitly homosexual journals in 1939, she complained with some amazement at their frankness. Why, if he can say all that, can't I come out with the comparatively modest truth about Roger and his affairs? It's the difference between France and England, she concludes. What she disliked most about traditional English biography was its pretense of order and completeness. The art of biography, her phrase, creates an illusion of wholeness. Biography sets out to tell you that a life can be described, summed up, packaged, and sold. Family history is marshalled to explain what came later. A judicial mixture of social context, factual reporting, and personal analysis adds up to a recognizable, consistent, accurate presentation of character. This sounds fine, except that Virginia Woolf spent most of her life saying that that idea of biography is, to use a word she liked, poppycock. She put this brilliantly, I think, in a 1930 review of A New Life of Christina Rossetti. Here is the past and all its inhabitants, miraculously sealed as in a magic tank. All we have to do is to look and to listen and to listen and to look, and soon the little figures, for they are rather under life size, will begin to move and to speak. And as they move, we shall arrange them in all sorts of patterns of which they were ignorant, for they thought when they were alive that they could go where they liked. And as they speak, we shall read into their sayings all kinds of meanings which never struck them, for they believed when they were alive that they said straight off whatever came into their heads. But once you are in a biography, all is different. Why should being in a biography be so different? Because, as her characters keep telling each other, we are not all of a piece. You will recognize this quotation. For she had a great variety of selves to call upon, far more than we have been able to find room for, since a biography is considered complete if it merely accounts for 6 or 7 selves, whereas a person may well have as many thousand. That concept of the multiple self with which Orlando makes such brilliant play is one of Virginia Woolf's central recommendations for a truer, more exemplary kind of biography for the modern world, and most especially for the telling of a woman's life. Her feminist program is, of course, above all, a literary program. It is inextricably bound up with her desire to revolutionize biography. She wants to find new forms, new models for what Caroline Heilbronn has called women's as yet unnarrated lives. In 3 Guineas, for instance, the word biography is constantly repeated. Biographies are read here, particularly the rich and revealing Victorian biographies, to find one story hidden under another. Let us go on looking, if not at the lines, then between the lines of biography. Biography in 3 Guineas is like an oracle, a cryptic text from which a hidden and very important message has to be decoded. Lurking inside it is the evidence of male attitudes to women, fathers' infantile fixations on their daughters, for instance, or assumptions that all women should marry, of women's struggle for education, their attitudes to war, their attempts to enter the professions. There are good jokes about biography in 3 Guineas. She says we need a female biography of God, since it looks as if a male biography of the deity would resolve itself into a dictionary of clerical biography. But it mainly derives from its reading of biographies, a furious analysis of patriarchal discrimination, censorship, and silencing. Biography, too, and I don't need to tell you this, is all important in A Room of One's Own, of which the climax is famously what she calls herself a fascinating and masterly biography of Shakespeare's imaginary sister, as much of a genius as her brother, but doomed by her sex to a life of exploitation, pain, and failure. Like so much of Virginia Woolf's feminist writing, this biographical fantasy is at once historical and utopian, a tragic description of what women's lives have been like, and an empowering fantasy of how they might become different. When you put Virginia Woolf's scattered writings on biography together, you can see her making up a number of rules which are very suggestive for her biographer. She wanted modern biography to be uncensored. She wanted it to be truthful and unreverential. She wanted it to be intimate. It should make you feel you know the person better than the biographer. With us, she says in 1920, the test of a good biography is that it leaves us with the impulse to write it all over again. Who can know him, we cry out, half as intimately as we do? I love the fact that she says write it all over again and not read it all over again. She wanted it to involve social history, sharp details, talk and funny stories. She wanted it to be like gossip. Gossip was one of her arts. Her base qualities of malice, spite, and treachery fueled the qualities we value her for, her imagination, her observation, her brilliance, and her energy. In gossip, low motives and high skills cannot be disentangled. Especially when she was with her homosexual friend, she took intense, even erotic pleasure in tattle, or what Christopher Ricks has unkindly called tit for tattle. Its addictive competitiveness and riskiness excited her. The gay art of gossip corresponded to her own desire to make pointed and minute analyses of what, in Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick's phrase, what kinds of people there are to be found in one's world, and which thus closely resembles the art of biography. Like gossip, biography should record changes in people, not present a fixed personality. Generalizations, summings up, are fatal, since we are always altering. Habits, she says, gradually change the face of one's life as time changes one's physical face, and one does not know it. The biographer's job is to spot it. A self that goes on changing, she says, is a self that goes on living. So too with the biography of that self. Just as lives don't stay still, so life writing cannot be finalized. Our ideas are shifting about what can be said. Our knowledge of human character is changing. The biographer has to be a pioneer, she says, going ahead of the rest of us like the miner's canary, testing the atmosphere, detecting falsity, unreality, and the presence of obsolete conventions. And so there are some stories which have to be retold by each generation. Virginia Woolf is talking about Shelley there, but she could be talking about her own life story. And for me, as her latest biographer in the procession of Virginia Woolf biographers, those are encouraging words. Thank you. Now, you have to follow the rules. And I think this is very daunting. I wouldn't want to get up and stand by this. But he says that's what you have to do. So if anybody does want to make a break for the microphone and start a trickle of people coming towards this mic, rather than everyone's fleeing for the door. Thank you. Okay.
I should say that I haven't read the whole biography yet, but
it's long.
I have read, especially the first chapter, which you read from, I think, today, talking about the different earlier biographers very sharply, how they fit into their period. And perhaps this is an unfair question to ask so shortly after you've written it, but how would you locate your own biography itself? And I don't mean that skeptically, because I think if any biography has sort of been non-reductive and just sort of pulled it all together, yours is the best candidate I know of. But how does it, what are its characteristics other than non-reductiveness or faithfulness? What are its more positively phrased?
All right, thank you. I think there are two things I want to say in answer to that. When I looked back at my notes, you know, when you start a project, you have very amorphous notes towards the very beginning. You don't quite know what you're going to do. And you write down things that you hope will help you later on. And I found this early notebook. It took me 5 years to write, so it was a long time ago. And it said, this is all about structure. And if you can get this right, then you may be able to do it. And I think, if you ask me what I think is characteristic, or, you know, where my biography, how it works, I think what I was trying to do very much, and I've suggested that already, was to get away from a predictably chronological, linear and conclusive kind of biography. I mean, actually, to start with, I wanted to throw chronology completely out of the window, not have a life story, but just have different moods and moments and themes in her life. And I realized very quickly that was not possible, because you've got to have the story. You've got to have what Forster calls, you know, the tapeworm of the story. So what I then tried to do was sort of move between chronology and something more thematic. And although we do not live our lives by themes, nevertheless, there are things which recur and come back to haunt us in our lives, very much in her life. And when she talks about, in planning Mrs. Dalloway, that what she wants to do is to hollow out big caves, you remember, behind her characters, so that at any moment you will be walking down the street or at the party, but your mind will be full of all the other experiences in your life. I wanted to try and find some kind of form that would present that or represent that. So that's why, for instance, there's a chapter in the book called Reading, which is a chapter in which it's actually my favorite chapter in the book, but nothing happens in this chapter. It's like this terrible problem of, you know, when somebody is an artist, how do you present what they mainly do in their life? I mean, she talks about that in Orlando, you know, Monday passed, Tuesday, Wednesday, you know, still he's just sitting there. And it's, you know, I always remember that terrible film, The Music Lovers. Did you ever see that film, which was a biopic of Tchaikovsky? And there's all these terrible sort of attempts to get Tchaikovsky composing reading. And there's a wonderful moment when he's sitting at the piano and his brother says to him, "You know what the matter with you is, Tchaikovsky? You're pathetic." And he goes, "Ah, yes." This, you know, it's like there's Trotsky, meet Lenin, you know. And I didn't want to do that, but I wanted to try and get inside what it felt to be her when she's reading, because of course she writes so brilliantly and so much about the actual experiences of reading, where you are a different person if you are reading a different book. This is a very postmodernist idea of reading, where she's saying books, you know, you don't read books, books read you. It's interesting that the only lecture I think she gave to a girls' school was called How Should One Read a Book? And in that lecture she says, read it as if you were the writer. Don't read it as if you were the reader. Read it as if you're sort of inside the writing of the book. So, sorry, I've gone off the track, but that was one of the caves that I tried to sort of, you know, stay in for a while and think about. It also seems to me that when you write chronological, when you read chronological biography, you get a whole lot of facts, and sometimes you forget them, and someone appears and then they come back 2 years later and you're reminded that you know, they had tea with them 2 years before, but you don't sort of get the sense of the whole relationship. So with the chapter on Catherine, the chapter on Vita, the chapter on Ethel, I wanted to try to bring those relationships together. So that structure is one thing. The other thing, I suppose, that if I have a line, and people, when I was working on it, as anyone working on a big book will get asked, they would say, what is your line on her? And I found this very distressing. I used to get very uncomfortable when people asked me this, and I was embarrassed, and I couldn't answer the question, and I felt I couldn't say, I don't know yet. Perhaps I'll know when I've finished. But I think if I did have a line on her, it was to do with trying to get away from the idea of Virginia Woolf as a fragile victim, as someone who was always hurting, as someone profoundly damaged. I rather wanted to see her as a heroically professional woman worker. You know, I think of her as somebody who is enormously energetic, stoical, courageous, and who does a fantastic amount of work and is fantastically intelligent about the work that she's doing. And so I suppose that's the kind of, I didn't want to ignore or belittle the terrible problems in her life, but I suppose that is my sense of her. So sorry, it's a long answer to the question, but it's a challenging question.
Did you meet and talk with Quentin Bell prior to his death, and what impact did that have?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning.
Did you meet and talk with Quentin Bell prior to, he knew you were working upon this, and how did that affect or not affect the work?
I miss Quentin. I came to be very friendly with him, and he just died. He died a wonderful death in his family, in the bosom of his family, rather Victorian death, actually, in full possession of his faculties. His son had just been talking to him about a review he was writing of an artist, and Julian had said to Quentin, "The more I read about this, the less I seem to know." And Quentin said, "Very wise," and died. Which is a good... he was very generous to me. He said, "I wish you luck with my aunt." And very fierce, very critical. We didn't agree at all about the politics. Quentin thought that 3 Guineas is a waste of time. He thinks it's a ridiculous book. And we had a long correspondence about that, which I've kept, which was very interesting to me. And Olivia, of course, Olivia Bell was the sort of guardian of every detail of Virginia Woolf's life, and, you know, was very quick to put me right and to also give me lots and lots of information. So yes, I would go and sit at their table and drink lots of wine and gin and talk about Virginia Woolf and the family. It's not so much that when you go, there's a strange thing of going to see very distinguished people towards the end of their life and saying to them, "Could you just tell me about the 5 minutes you spent with Virginia Woolf?" As you know, it's a sort of oddly insulting thing to do in a way. You start to think, who are they going to be coming round to me for? You know, in 20 years' time, it's going to be some writer I really hated and that I once met, and that's the only thing people are going to want to talk to me about when I'm 90. You know. It's a sort of strange thing. And also people's stories, if they've been telling their stories for 55 years, they're kind of hardened, they're set. You know, you're probably not going to get any new information. And the secrets, and I'm sure there were secrets, and all biographers feel that there are things they haven't been told and things they haven't found out. The secrets are very well kept now. And so it wasn't so much getting new information, it was hearing the tone of voice. You know, Quentin Bell bore a remarkable resemblance to Leslie Stephen. And when you know, this extraordinary, these huge ears and this great dome and this noble brown, these piercing, pale blue eyes and that unmistakable Stephen voice, you know, just that is rather remarkable. Olivia referred to the people who used to come and visit him as beard touchers.
You've obviously put a great deal into your biography. I don't know if you've left anything out because you couldn't find a place where it belonged. And since you didn't use chronology to organize it, how did you know when you were finished?
Well, it's two questions, really. I mean, the thing about leaving stuff out is interesting because actually it was much longer. I'm sorry it's so heavy. My father said, this is a very uncomfortable book to read in bed. But it is long and heavy. But I did have a lot more which went. And it's funny, you know, anyone does this. You work on something for a long time. You think there's a whole chunk that's terribly necessary to you. Like I had page after page after page about the Bloomsbury Group. Massive amounts of material on in the Bloomsbury chapter. And then I thought, I don't actually, you know, people know this. I don't need this. So it's sort of got buried. I think a lot of that stuff, it's buried. You know, you need to have written it, but you don't in the end need to use it. But we all know that it's hard to decide to get rid of your cherished bit that you spent 3 months working on. You think, sorry, no, you're gone, you know. So I did cut out stuff, and there were lots. I mean, because she knew so many people, there are lots of relationships that I became very fascinated by, which are minor relationships in her life. And if I had spent more time on them, I would have unbalanced things. So that, for instance, I got very fascinated by her edge-on relationship with the poets of the 30s. With the writers of the 30s. I think her interest in Isherwood, for instance, and the fact she was on to Isherwood and liked him and could see what he was like. Very interesting. The fact she didn't know Auden, but she was listening to all that. And of course it comes out in things like Letters to a Young Poet. So I would have loved to do more with that. I still would like to do more with that. But you know, if I'd done more with that, then the whole thing would have got unbalanced elsewhere. So it's all about balance and structure. How did I know when I'd finished? Well, I knew that I wanted to say something about myself at the very end of the book, because I think to pretend to invisibility and objectivity as a biographer is silly. I mean, I didn't want to say I throughout the book, as some biographers do. But so I knew that I wanted to have a little section at the end about the sort of journey, the footsteps thing, the sort of journey that I'd made. So it does actually end. I always knew I wanted to do this. The story of the book begins with the Stephen children revisiting the house in St Ives. And you know that scene where they go to the house, they look through the hedge at the bottom of the garden at these lighted windows of the house, and they can't go in because it's not their house anymore. I'm totally touched by that image. And so I ended the book with the story of my return to my going to Talent House, which then, it's changed hands now, but it was then owned by a very cross man who met me at the door, wouldn't let me in, and said, look, when I bought this house, I never heard of this bloody woman, and now I can't call my life my own. You know, I look around, there's Japanese people in my bathroom, there's Americans in the bedroom, you know, go away. And in fact, it's interesting because apparently the person before him who had turned the house into flats for, you know, people coming to have a holiday in Cornwall, had realised there was some literary association, but had got it slightly wrong. So they put up a big sign saying, Talent House, home of Virginia Woolf, wife of the famous novelist. You know, there's no blue plaque.
I'm interested what you had to say about meeting with Quentin Bell and Olivia Bell, and I was wondering if you had met and what your impressions were and how helpful Angelica Garnett was, because
yes.
You know, we've read her book.
Yeah. Can you all hear these questions? Yes, Angelica Garnett. I did meet Angelica, not often. She lives in France. She was the soul of helpfulness and kindness, and very, I don't know, I think I was very lucky. I just felt that she was friendlily disposed towards me. Her book, I'm very, very interested in, Deceived with Kindness. It seems to me such an interesting book and a brave book to have written. And I think it blows the lid on the myth of Bloomsbury openness in a most fascinating way, and has not altogether gone down well with other surviving members of the family. But I mean, this is kind of boasting, but I'm going to boast. Just that Angelica wrote me a letter after. I was very anxious to know what she would think of it. And she wrote me a letter when she'd read the book in which she said, it's extraordinary to me that you didn't know her. And this, I couldn't have, this just was wonderful. So she's been very generous. She's very beautiful, Angelica Garnett. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Two?
Quick, you were saying how much Quentin Bell denigrated 3 Unis. That's very important correspondence. Do you think you'll be able to publish it at any time?
That would depend on Olivia, I think, is the short answer to that.
And my next question, the fact that Leonard Woolf, a writer's diary, that it creates such a portrait of Virginia as, perhaps I might use the word neurasthenic. What does that say to us about the marriage, about that you could construct her in that way?
Yes, it's an interesting question. I don't think by publishing a writer's diary that as it was, in the form that it was, Leonard Woolf intended to propagate a version of Virginia Woolf as neurasthenic. I don't think that was what was in his mind at all. I think he felt there were all sorts of people who were living who would be very, very upset by the extremely catty and outrageous things that she had said about them. And that went on being a problem with the editing of the letters and so on. But I think he felt that the public had a right to know that here is this extraordinary diary, which we are so privileged to have, about, nothing equals it in my mind, except maybe Henry James's notebooks about the creative processes of a writer's mind. So I think it would be unfair to Leonard, and people have often been unfair to Leonard, it seems to me, to suggest that was the aim. I mean, if you're asking me also about the marriage, in my view, the marriage has been rather over-denigrated as a kind of overprotective guardianship, and that Leonard is the sort of dragon at the gate, the person who always wanted to sort of crush her enthusiasms, the dry, harsh rationalist, is a version which I didn't feel was right when I read into the correspondence and talked to people and read his own work. My feeling about that marriage is that although not highly charged erotically, though I do think there was a lot of cuddling sexual play, secret sexual play, actually, in that marriage. I mean, we don't know what goes on in other people's marriages. Was an extraordinary partnership in that it was a conversation. It was a conversation that went on, even when they badly disagreed with each other, as they did, for instance, about the role of pacifism and whether one could go on maintaining a pacifist position in the late 30s. I think they were completely at odds there. They were completely at odds about a lot of people. I mean, Leonard Woolf couldn't stand Ethel Smythe, found her absolutely intolerable. There are many areas of disagreement, but I think it was a conversation which went on. It was not the kind of marriage where you end up saying, pass the marmalade, dear, and what time are you coming back from the office? It never was like that, and I admire that greatly. Just a footnote about the difficulties of the embarrassment of publishing stuff about people who knew her. When Nigel Nicholson came to edit the letters, there were a lot of people still living. He had a lot of problems with this, and there were various people who were very, very upset when the early volumes came out about what she had said, and Raymond Mortimer was particularly touchy. So if you look at the index under Mortimer Raymond, it will say page 59, delightful visit from, page 123, very pleasant afternoon spent with. See also pages 96, 270. If you look at page 96, it said, that frightful little shit Raymond Mortimer. I mean, she doesn't, I'm sorry, she doesn't say that. She says creep, or, wasted my whole afternoon when I could have been writing, Mrs. Dalloway. I'm making this up, but it's a sort of, there was a real problem about living people. Sorry.
I have two questions that I think are tenuously related. It struck me and I can't elaborate on this, that it was a very English biography of Woolf. And I wondered who you idealized as your reader writing it. And also, do you think your political Woolf would have been possible without the last quarter century of American Woolf criticism?
Yes. The answer to the last question is absolutely not, no. I mean, I could not have possibly written this book without the work that's been done on her. And one of the points of writing this book now is to try and, in part, synthesize and build in, as I have tried to do in the book, you know, the ways in which she has been read. So I completely, you know, agree with that. Yes, I'm very glad that you think it's a very English Woolf. It is an odd fact that since Winifred Holtby, there hasn't been a full-length biography of her by an English woman writer. Lyndall Gordon is South African in origin. It is just a curious fact, that. And so, you know, that was perhaps, I mean, it's odd credential, but it was one reason for doing it. And one of the things I have tried to think about all the way through the book, and I've been very much influenced by Gillian Beer's work in this, is her sense of her Englishness and what it means to be an English writer living at the time that she does. So I take that as a great compliment, that you think it is a very English Woolf. If you think that, I mean, I don't know, one idealizes one's writer, one's reader. I don't know that one idealizes a reader. I wanted it to be read by people who were generally interested in Virginia Woolf, and by people like yourselves who know all about her. I mean, I wanted it to be that mixture of readers. That's it, I think.